The truth about pain is that it doesn't always start with you. Sometimes it begins generations before you even take your first breath. And the worst part, you carry it as if it's your own fault. I didn't know I was carrying a weight I didn't earn. I just thought I was broken. I thought my fear of failure was my personal weakness. I thought my rage was my own problem. I thought my constant self-doubt was proof of something fundamentally wrong with me. I thought all of it originated in me, lived in me, was entirely mine to solve. But the truth was so much darker and so much more complicated. I didn't understand any of this until I was sitting across from my mother. I was 47 years old. We were arguing about something small, something meaningless on the surface. I can't even remember what it was now. But in the way these things happen, the moment escalated. My voice got louder. Hers got sharper. And then something happened that stopped us both cold. I was screaming the same words my grandmother screamed, the same tones, the same cadence, the same fear underneath the anger. The same silence that followed afterward. I heard it. She heard it. We both went absolutely still. It was like looking in a mirror, except the reflection wasn't me. It was a shadow, an echo, something passed down, carefully hidden in plain sight, waiting in my DNA for the right trigger to come alive. I was 20 years old when my grandmother died. I barely remembered her voice, but somehow it was living in my body, speaking through my mouth, without my permission or knowledge. That moment cracked something open inside me. Because I suddenly understood that I wasn't just me. I was a collection of inherited patterns, a living archive of family wounds, a vessel carrying pain that wasn't even mine to begin with. That's what generational trauma does. It hides in patterns. It whispers through the decisions you make. It lives in the moods you can't explain. It shows up in the invisible rules you've inherited and never questioned. It sits at the table at family gatherings and nobody names it, but everybody feels it. It says, don't try too hard. You'll just fail anyway. Don't trust too easily. Everyone leaves. Protect yourself by hurting first. Love isn't safe. Anger is the only language. Silence is survival. I started to see everywhere. In my father's tight jaw, the constant tension, the way his face would close down when anything emotional came up. In my uncle's bitterness, the way he'd talk about his life like it was something that had happened to him rather than something he was living. In the silences at family gatherings, that particular quality of quiet, where nobody was actually present, but nobody was absent either. We were all just there carrying something too heavy to name, too old to fix, too familiar to question. I started to understand that we were all carrying invisible scars, wounds we'd inherited from parents and grandparents we'd never met, traumas we never experienced directly but were trained to expect, survival mechanisms that had outlived the danger but still governed our choices. My grandmother had survived things I'd never asked about. My grandfather had ways of being in the world that had been passed down to my father and become part of how I was taught to survive. The ways my mother handled fear, the ways she managed anger, the ways she taught me to be small and careful, all of it was a direct transmission of her own pain. And I was about to do the same thing. I was about to pass it on. I could see it happening. I could see how my anxiety was bleeding into my relationships, how my fear was limiting other people's choices, how my inherited trauma was becoming someone else's inherited trauma. I was about to do what my family had done to me. I was about to hand down the curse without even realizing it was a curse. That's when I realized something terrifying. I had almost passed it on without noticing, to friends, to siblings, to my own habits and pattern. I was a carrier, something I didn't understand, transmitting pain I did, cause in service of survival mechanisms that were no longer relevant. And if I didn't stop, if I didn't wake up, if I didn't start paying attention, it would continue. The cycle would roll on, the pattern would repeat, and someone else would be sitting in a room one day, hearing their grandmother's voice come out of their own mouth, and they'd realize they were a ghost wearing someone else's skin. That's when I started paying attention, not just to my own mind, but to my family's history. I started asking questions I'd never asked before. I started naming things that had never been named. I started looking at the mistakes, the silences, the unspoken grief that had shaped everything. I learned about my grandmother's childhood, the circumstances that made her hard, the losses that taught her to be cold, the reasons she couldn't be soft with my mother, which is why my mother couldn't be soft with me, which is why I'd inherited a particular kind of emotional shutdown that I thought was my personality. I learned about my grandfather's silence, the war he'd been in, the things he'd seen, the reasons he'd come back unable to speak about emotion, which meant my father learned that feelings were dangerous, which meant I learned that vulnerability was weakness. I learned about the poverty my parents had experienced, the desperation, the way it taught them to hoard, to fear scarcity, to believe that there was never enough, which meant I inherited a sense of insufficientness that had nothing to do with my actual circumstances and everything to do with their survival. I saw the patterns everywhere, in the ways I pushed people away, in the ways I self-sabotaged when things got good, in the ways I braced for disaster, in the ways I prepared for abandonment, in the ways I chose people who couldn't actually love me, because at least I understood that kind of pain. It was familiar. I realized something fundamental. I am not cursed. I am trained to react, trained to survive, trained to hide, trained by people who were doing the best they could with the tools they had, which is to say they were doing the best they could with inherited trauma and no understanding of what they were passing on. But awareness is the key. The moment you see the pattern, the moment you understand where it came from, the moment you stop blaming yourself for inherited wounds, that's when you have a choice. I started breaking patterns, small choice at a time. I started saying what I felt instead of swallowing it. This was revolutionary in my family. We were people who kept things inside. We managed emotion through avoidance. But I started to admit when I was hurt. I started to admit when I was scared. I started to admit when I was struggling instead of pretending I had it handled. And it was terrifying. Because in my family, admitting struggle was the same as failing. It was proof that you couldn't handle life. It was weakness. But I did it anyway. I named the pain. I said the hard things out loud. I started asking for help instead of pretending I didn't need it. This went against everything I've been taught. I've been taught that needing people was dangerous, that independence was survival, that asking for help meant putting yourself in a position to be hurt. But I started to reach out. I started to let people help me. I started to admit that I couldn't do everything alone. I started forgiving myself for things I didn't do, for my mother's wounds that I inherited, for my grandmother's trauma that I carry, for my grandfather's silence that lives in my body. I wasn't responsible for the pain they passed down, but I was responsible for whether I kept passing it. I started going to therapy. I started reading. I started learning about trauma and how it lives in the nervous system. I started understanding that the rage I felt, the fear carried, the ways I sabotaged myself, none of it was personality. All of it was pattern. All of it was learned. All of it could be unlearned. And slowly, so slowly that I almost didn't notice, I felt the weight lift. Not all at once, not dramatically, but incrementally. The tightness in my chest started to ease. The anger started to feel less reflexive. The fear started to feel like something I was experiencing rather than something that was defining me. I started to have relationships that weren't based on inherited fear. I started to make choices that weren't rooted in survival mode. I started to live like someone who believed the world wasn't inherently dangerous, even though part of me still carried that belief from my family. The cycle didn't vanish overnight. Generational trauma isn't a puzzle solved with a single move. It's not a problem you fix and then you're done. It's a forest you walk through. You're learning which paths are safe. You're learning which patterns are inherited. You're learning which ones you can finally leave behind. There's a concept in systems theory called morphic resonance. It's the idea that patterns can be transmitted across generations without anyone consciously teaching them. That trauma can leave impressions on a family system, and those impressions can continue to shape behavior even generations later. You're inheriting not just genes, but templates, not just DNA, but programming. The good news is patterns can be rewritten, programming can be updated, templates can be changed. But it requires consciousness. It requires paying attention. It requires looking at your family honestly and asking, what am I inheriting here? What patterns am I repeating without knowing why? What am I teaching my children? What am I transmitting to the people I love? I'm 56 years old now. That moment with my mother, that was 9 years ago. And it was the moment everything changed. Not because my life became perfect, but because I stopped being unconscious about the inheritance I was carrying and transmitting. I started to understand that I am not my family's mistake. I am the first chapter of a new story. The pain they experienced is real. Their trauma was real. Their survival was real. But my obligation to repeat it isn't real. My obligation to pass it on isn't real. I can feel the pain. I can honor what my ancestors endured. I can understand where the patterns came from. And I can still choose differently. I can still break the cycle. I can still be the generation that says, this ends here, not with me, not anymore. That's the quiet revolution. That's where healing actually happens. Not in forgetting the past, but in consciously deciding not to repeat it. Not in judging your ancestors for the patterns they passed down, but in gratefully receiving their survival and respectfully declining to pass on their trauma. When you finally start naming the inherited wounds, something shifts. When you start consciously choosing differently, even when it's hard, even when it feels wrong, even when it goes against everything you've been taught, the ghosts lose their grip. They don't disappear. The ancestors are still there. The family history is still there. But they stop controlling you. You stop being a puppet dancing on inherited strings. You start being a person making conscious choices about your own life. And that's when freedom begins. So if you're out there right now and you're noticing patterns you can't explain, and you're hearing your parents' voice in your own voice, and you are wondering why you sabotage yourself in the same ways they did, and you are terrified that you're going to pass it all on, that's not a curse. That's awareness. That's the beginning of freedom. That's the moment where you can choose differently. You can look at your family history honestly. You can ask the hard questions. You can learn where the patterns came from. And you can decide, this is what I inherited. This is what was done to me. This is what was passed down. But this is what I choose. I choose to break the pattern. I choose to feel the pain and still rise above it. I choose to be the generation that finally stops running the old program and writes a new one. You are not your family's mistakes. You are not your ancestors' trauma. You are not condemned to repeat their patterns. You are the first chapter of a new story, and you get to decide what that story says. That's the part everyone needs to hear. That's the message that matters. You can feel the pain. You can honor where it came from, and you can still choose to rise above it. You can still choose to break the cycle. You can still choose to be the one who finally says no. The ghosts will keep whispering. The inherited patterns will keep tugging at your choices. But you don't have to listen. You don't have to obey. You don't have to pass it on. You can be the one who stops. You can be the one who heals. You can be the one who breaks the cycle and finally sets your family free. Not just yourself, your entire family line. Everyone who comes after you. Everyone who never knew this weight existed, but will be lighter because you had the courage to put it down. That's the power you have. That's what awareness gives you. The ability to stop the transmission. The ability to break the pattern. The ability to finally be free.